She was left in her wedding dress at a dusty trading post, humiliated and alone. But when a masked rancher claimed her without a word, the frontier would never be the same again. The noon sun hung like a punishment over the Montana plains, casting heat waves across the bleached wood and rusted tin roofs of the old Clearwater trading post. A stagecoach kicked up a ghostly trail of dust as it disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a silence that seemed to mock the woman now standing alone on the cracked porch. Her white dress, once elegant, now looked as out of place as lace at a funeral. She didn't cry, not yet, but the wind toyed with the edge of her veil like it knew what had just happened. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and her groom had left her with nothing but a half-empty satchel and a promise broken before it was ever spoken. Clara had traveled nearly 400 miles from Missouri, following love, or what she thought was love, a letter, a proposal, a promise of a new life in the wild frontier. She had believed every word of it, even when her father had slammed the door behind her. The man she was meant to marry, Jonathan Merck, never showed. Instead, a folded note had been left with the driver. 3 short lines that shattered her world. I can't do it. I'm not the man you think I am. Forgive me. No one came to offer help. The postmaster glanced once and went back inside. A few cowhands stared from across the road, saying nothing. Clara felt the weight of judgment heavier than her own sorrow. In a town where reputations stuck like thorns, she wasn't a bride anymore. She was a woman who'd been rejected, and that made her dangerous and wanted, suspicious. The sky darkened slowly as the afternoon stretched toward evening. Clara sat on the edge of the post stoop, hands tucked in her lap, her suitcase beside her. Like a gravestone, flies circled. A tumbleweed rolled past like a punchline. And yet she stayed, back straight, eyes locked on the horizon, as though she could will Jonathan into returning. But he was gone, and the wind carried only silence. By sundown, even the saloon had stopped pretending not to look at her. A gambler stepped out, tipped his hat mockingly, and went back inside. The innkeeper closed his shutters early, pretending not to see her when she approached. She asked no one for help. She knew better. The prairie didn't take pity, it tested, it measured, and it forgot. But something about her refusal to collapse, to beg, began to unsettle those who watched. Then, just before dusk vanished completely, hooves. Not many, just one horse, slow, deliberate. The rider came in from the south, where the buttes turned red at sunset. He wore a long coat of black leather and a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A black bandana covered the bottom half. Most would have thought him an outlaw. Most did. The town quieted the way it did before gunfire. But no gun was drawn. He didn't dismount, didn't speak. Just looked at Clara for a long moment, then at the satchel beside her feet. She didn't flinch, didn't ask who he was. Her eyes didn't show fear, only a quiet kind of resignation that surprised even the rider. Without a word, he leaned slightly and extended a gloved hand. For the first time all day, Clara moved with intention. He stood, dusted off her skirt, and placed her hand in his. It was a choice made not in desperation, but in defiance. A woman abandoned had just accepted the hand of a stranger, and in doing so, wrote the first line of a story the town would never forget. He lifted her onto the saddle behind him. The horse turned, and together they vanished into the night. No name exchanged, no destination spoken. Just dust in the wind, and whispers on every lip. From that moment on, folks at Clearwater said the masked rider had claimed her not in marriage, not in mercy, but as if reclaiming something lost a long time ago. And Clara, she didn't speak of that day for a long while. But deep down, in the marrow of her bones, she knew the real journey had only just begun. The ride through the canyons was long and wordless, the rhythm of hooves echoing like a slow heartbeat against the still bones of the frontier. The masked rider did not turn to speak, and Clara did not ask. She simply held on, her veil torn by the wind, her wedding dress now bearing the grime of the open range. Somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief, she gave in to the silence, let it wrap around her like a shroud. She didn't know his name. She didn't even know his eyes, but something about the way he rode steady, unwavering told her this man did not deal in accidents. He'd come to the trading post for a reason. They arrived just before dawn at a ranch tucked in the folds of the Red Dust Valley. The land was barren at first glance, dry grass and barbed fences, but it whispered with old stories land that had seen blood, birth, and betrayals. The main house was built from thick timber and age-worn stone, not grand, but honest. A barn stood nearby, its roof patched with tin, and far beyond it, hills rolled toward the horizon like waves frozen in time. It wasn't paradise, but it was. Far from where she had been left, the rider helped her down, then disappeared inside the barn. Clara didn't follow. Instead, she stood at the gate, breathing the dawn air, staring at the house like it might vanish if she blinked. Behind her, a white mare in the corral lifted its head and watched her silently, almost as if sensing that she too had been caged, ridden, and forgotten. Hours passed before the rider returned. His mask was still on. He handed her a folded blanket and a canteen, then walked past her into the house. No words, no gestures of welcome, but Clara took the blanket and followed. Inside, the ranch was clean but sparse, the kind of place where furniture was meant for resting, not showing off. A faded photograph of a woman and child sat on the mantel. Both faces were scratched out. She didn't ask. The following days unfolded in quiet repetition. The masked man rose before the sun, worked the fields, fixed the fences, mended saddles. Clara, with nothing else to do and no expectation laid on her, began cleaning, cooking, scrubbing the dust from corners no one had cared about in years. She found solace in purpose. No one asked her to do it, but she couldn't sit idle while memories of rejection chewed at her soul. In a way, the silence between them was sacred. They didn't share their pasts. They shared survival, but the town of Clearwater hadn't forgotten her. And rumors don't ride slow in the frontier. Whispers grew. The abandoned bride was now shacked up with a masked outlaw. Some said he was a bounty hunter who'd gone rogue. Others said he'd once been a preacher whose family was burned alive. No one could agree on who he really was, but all agreed on one thing. The man in black had taken the girl in white, and that meant trouble was coming. It came in the form of men, 3 of them, riding hard and uninvited. Hired guns, or maybe just fools paid in whiskey and pride. Clara saw them from the kitchen window one afternoon, dust kicking up behind their horses like a storm announcing itself. She froze, hands still in soapy water, her breath shallow. The masked man was by the barn. He looked up once, then calmly returned to hammering a horseshoe. The riders dismounted without knocking. One spat tobacco near the porch. Another ran a hand along the rail like he owned it. The third smirked toward the door. Clara didn't open it. She didn't need to. These weren't visitors. They were wolves sniffing for a fight, for a story, for power over a woman who'd already been discarded once. The kind of men who believed that what the world abandoned was theirs to claim. What they didn't know, what Clara hadn't even realized until then, was that the man she now shared a roof with wasn't just a mystery. He was a reckoning wrapped in silence. And when he finally walked to the porch, hammer still in hand, and stood between her and those men, the air itself shifted. Like the land was holding its breath, the men laughed, for a moment. Then one reached for his belt. It was the only mistake he ever made. The air cracked before anyone saw the flash. A single shot, so clean it sounded like it came from the earth itself. The man who had reached for his belt stumbled backward, stunned more by the speed than the pain. Blood blossomed across his shoulder. Like a rose too early in bloom, his gun never even cleared leather. The second man flinched, but the masked rancher had already moved home as dusk, deadly as thunder rolling over dry plains. He didn't speak, didn't posture. His presence alone carried the weight of a dozen warnings. the hammer in his left. Hands still swung from his grip, but it was the revolver in his right that owned the silence now. The third rider backed down first. His eyes darted between the fallen man and the steady barrel, reading the truth in the stillness. This wasn't a fight they'd walked into a reckoning. Clara watched from behind the screen door, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles whitened. Something ancient stirred in her, not fear, but something close to its respect shaped by awe. The men she'd followed into the unknown had just faced down 3 armed strangers without raising his voice, without breaking a sweat. He didn't need a reputation. He was the story others would whisper from now on. The wounded man cursed under his breath, cradling his arm, and stumbled toward his horse with help. The other 2 followed, dragging shame and silence in their wake. They didn't look back. No one ever did once they'd been spared by someone who had every reason not to. The dust hadn't settled before the rancher turned, walked past Clara, and disappeared inside. No thanks, no questions, no expression. Clara didn't try to speak either. She stepped outside instead, took in the scorched scent of gunpowder and pride, and began washing the blood-stained porch with the same bucket she'd used to mop the kitchen floor. The message had been delivered to the world beyond the valley. She was not alone anymore, and the man who had claimed her. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was louder than most men's fury. But as the days passed, Clara began to notice things. Small things. The man never removed his mask. Not when he ate, not even in sleep if he ever did sleep. At night, he sat on the porch with a rifle across his knees, staring at the distant hills like a ghost waiting to be called back into war. And though he never touched her, never crossed boundaries, there was a weight between them, something unspoken, unfinished. Clara knew pain when she saw it. She had worn it herself. But his pain wasn't abandonment. It was guilt, regret thick as tar. She sensed it in the way he touched the bridle of his horse, how he flinched when thunder rolled in the distance, how he traced the frame of the scratched photograph on the mantel when he thought she wasn't watching. One evening, just before the monsoon winds began to whisper through the grasslands, she found an old ledger buried under a floorboard in the barn. It was worn, weather-beaten, pages smudged by sweat and dirt, names, dates, places, some crossed out in thick black ink, some marked with a red X at the back. A single line in hurried handwriting read, "They killed her. They thought I was dead. I'll make sure they learn what dying really means." The truth crashed over her like a storm. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a man running from vengeance and toward it at the same time. The next day, he didn't return from his ride. By sundown, Clara waited on the porch, the lantern burning beside her as fireflies blinked in the tall grass. Midnight came, and still no sign. She knew better than to panic. This land ate weakness like bread, but something didn't sit right. The air felt wrong, too still. Too quiet. Then came the knock. Not at the door, but on the fence rail. A small sound, intentional. Clara rose slowly. In the moonlight stood a boy no older than 15, wearing a newsboy cap and a torn vest. He held out a note. His voice cracked. When he spoke, barely above a whisper, the rancher had been taken. East Ridge, midnight ambush. No demands, just bait. Clara's breath caught. Her hands curled into fists. They'd come for the rancher, but what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Clara Whitmore, once left in the dust of rejection, was no longer the same. Redemption had changed its shape. It now had a spine, calloused hands, and a fire burning behind wetting eyes. She looked to the rifle hanging above the fireplace, then back at the rising dust trail on the horizon. This time, she wasn't waiting to be saved. The moon lit the prairie like a sheet of silver draped across a battlefield not yet written in blood. Clara rode alone now, dressed not in the gown that had once mocked her fate, but in trousers and boots scavenged from the ranch's storage room. The rifle strapped across her back bounced with each gallop. Her hair, once carefully styled for vows never spoken, now whipped behind her like a banner for something far more dangerous, vengeance. She followed the boy's directions toward East Ridge, a stretch of barren sandstone cliffs with jagged outcrops and dead trees like skeletal fingers clawing at the stars. A place too quiet for anything but violence. She remembered everything. From the ledger, the masked rancher wasn't a monster. He was a man hollowed out by loss, his wife and child burned alive in a fire set by cattle barons when he refused to sell his land. They'd thought he died with them, but he had lived. And in doing so, he'd become something else. He had hunted down everyone but one. A name Clara recognized from the letters she once received. Jonathan Merck thought the man who left her at the trading post wasn't a coward. He was a collaborator. And now, he had taken the rancher. The trail ended at a circle of rocks beside a broken wagon, where the horse's tracks turned to boot prints and vanished into shadow. Clara dismounted and crouched low, her fingers brushing the dirt for clues. Ashes, a cigarette still warm. They were close. She moved like a ghost among the brush, her breath measured, the rifle steady in her grip. The sound of voices drifted. From the trees, gruff, confident, men who believed the night belonged to them, but Clara had walked through worse. Betrayal had tempered her, abandonment had forged her, and the silence of the man who once saved her had taught her how to wait. She crept toward the firelight, where 5 men surrounded a figure tied to a stake. The masked rancher's head hung low, blood streaking down his brow, hat missing, shirt torn. His hands were bound tight behind him, his boots kicked off, his back scorched where the fire's heat licked too close. One of the men laughed a slow, oily sound. Another raised a bottle and toasted the night, mocking the man who once made them run. Jonathan stood nearby, arms crossed, smirking. He wore a new coat, tailored and fine, a revolver gleaming at his side. Clara's breath caught, the same face, the same voice. But none of the lies had prepared her for the truth of what he'd become. The rifle didn't shake in her hands. She waited for the wind to shift, to mask the soft click of her cocked hammer. Then she stepped from the shadows and aimed for the lantern sitting on the crate. One shot, the lantern exploded in a burst of glass and flame, plunging the camp into chaos. The men scattered, blinded by dark and smoke, shouting, scrambling. The masked rancher lifted his head in disbelief as a second shot dropped the man holding the whip to his knees. Clara moved with the quiet rage of someone who'd fled for the wrong people. She advanced without a word, smoke curling around her like a cloak. Jonathan spun, drawing his pistol, but Clara had already fired. The bullet grazed his arm, spinning him backward into the dirt. He cursed, crawling for cover, yelling orders. 2 ghosts. One man tried to run, another reached for a shotgun, but neither got far. Clara's bullets found their marks not with rage, but with resolve. She reached the stake in seconds and dropped to her knees, cutting the rancher's bonds. With the same precision she used to slice bread on quiet mornings. He groaned, struggling to stand, but she steadied him with one hand and raised the rifle with the other. Behind them, Jonathan rose. He aimed. Clara turned. Their eyes met one last time. But before he could fire, the masked rancher reached out and pulled Clara aside, taking the bullet through the side. He collapsed into her arms, blood soaking his ribs. Jonathan tried to fire again, but the chamber clicked empty. And as he fumbled, Clara didn't hesitate. Her last bullet flew straight, fast, and final. Jonathan's body crumpled before he could speak. The wind howled over East Ridge, scattering the fire's ashes across the stones like forgotten prayers. Clara knelt beside the masked rancher, pressing her hands to the wound, whispering words he couldn't hear, but his hand found hers. His fingers, weak but sure, closed around her palm, and in that moment, for the first time since the trading post, she cried not for herself, but for the man who had taken a broken woman and given her something stronger than love, purpose. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of pain and silence. The masked rancher lay slumped against Clara, his weight shifting with the sway of the saddle. Blood seeped slowly through the bandages she had wrapped around his side with strips torn from her shirt, His breathing was shallow but steady. Clara held the reins with both hands, eyes fixed ahead, jaw clenched tight. The sun was beginning to rise again, but it brought no warmth, only the pressure of time slipping through her fingers. Each hoofbeat against the dry earth echoed like a ticking clock, daring her to fail when they finally reached the edge of the ranch. The familiar outline of the house stood like a promise, half in shadow, half in light. The barn doors creaked as she led the horse inside, easing him off the saddle and onto a pile of hay with the gentleness of someone handling glass. She cleaned his wound with rainwater collected in the trough, wincing every time he winced. His eyes fluttered open once, catching her gaze, then closed again as if trusting her completely. That trust bound her more than any vow ever could. She worked through the day, never resting. She fetched fresh linens, boiled herbs from the garden, stitched what needed stitching with a needle that trembled in her grip. The silence in the house was no longer cold, it was sacred. She had brought him back from the brink, and now all she could do was wait. Outside, the world moved on. The town of Clearwater buzzed with twisted versions of the truth. Some said Clara had gone mad and shot up a camp of bounty hunters. Others whispered that the masked rancher had been killed and she rode alone now, mourning what she had ruined. No one knew the real story, because no one had earned the right to it. But news travels fast on the frontier, and justice through justice moves. Slower than rumor. By the second night, the fever came. His body shook with it, soaked in sweat, fighting something deeper than blood loss. Clara sat beside him with a wet cloth, changing it every hour, whispering stories into the air, not to comfort him, but to fill the space between life and death with something that resembled hope. She told the walls how she used to believe in fairy tales, how she thought love came on paper and promises. But now she knew better. Redemption didn't wear silk. It wore scars. On the third day, his fever broke. Slowly, color returned to his face. He drank water without help. His hand found hers again, not in desperation, but in quiet strength. Still, he said nothing. He never did. But she understood him better than anyone ever had. They didn't need words. Their survival had become a language of its own. That evening, Clara stepped outside alone for the first time since the gunfight. The air was cool, the sky streaked with purples and oranges. She stood by the fence and looked out at the land. It wasn't hers, it wasn't his either, not really. But it was something they had both bled for, something no one had taken from them. She remembered standing on the trading post's porch in her white dress, forgotten and discarded like trash in the sun, and now she stood tall, no veil, no lace, no pretense, just grit and truth. Behind her, a figure appeared at the doorframe. The masked rancher, leaning heavily on the post, his chest bandaged, his strength returning in inches. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. Clara turned, nodded once, then walked to him and placed her hand over his heart. It beat slow but certain. The moment stretched. Not romantic, not dramatic, just real. Together, they went inside. Not as savior and saved, not as strangers thrown together by bad luck, but as two souls who had been broken by the same world and had chosen, in spite of it all, to stand back up. And from that porch, the dust rolled once again, soft and golden this time, not from abandonment, but from something rising, something lasting. The townsfolk wouldn't understand it. They'd gossip and guess, but no one would come near that ranch again. Not after what had happened. Not after what they heard about the woman who faced down 5 men and rode through the night for a man who never spoke her name. Clara didn't need their understanding. She had found her place. And in doing so, she had rewritten her own story. The days that followed were quiet, but not hollow. The rhythm of the ranch returned like a forgotten hymn. Clara mended fences with the same hands that had once stitched bullet wounds. The masked rancher, still healing, tended to the horses with slower steps but steadier breath. Neither rushed, neither explained. And yet every gesture they shared was filled with a deep, wordless understanding forged not in courtship, but in fire and grit. The ranch no longer felt like borrowed ground. It felt earned. Each morning, the sunrise crept in through the warped windows and cast long shadows across the floorboards, as if time itself were stretching to make room for a new chapter. Clara moved through the house with purpose, watering the garden, warming the stove, scrubbing away bloodstains that no longer haunted the wood. But as her task quieted the house, her mind wandered back to the ledger beneath the barn floor and the photograph with its scratched-out faces. The truth hadn't finished speaking. One morning, she returned to the barn alone. The ladder creaked as she descended into the crawlspace, dust blooming around her boots. She opened the ledger once more and read the names men crossed out, one by one. Some had died by fire, others by cold steel, but one remained uncrossed. Clara turned to the last page, where a name had been scratched into the margin in a different hand. It wasn't Jonathan's, it was her own. She stared at it for a long time. Then she understood. The rancher had once planned to find her too, not for love, not for rescue, but because she had been engaged to Jonathan Merck, one of the men who orchestrated the fire that killed his family. She had been on the list. A future Whitmore-Merck alliance would have given Jonathan the social cover to continue bleeding the land dry. Clara, unknowingly, had been one thread in a net meant to strangle the last honest man in Red Dust Valley. But something had stopped the rancher. Perhaps it was the look on her face when he first saw her on that trading post porch, lost and refused. Not guilty but discarded. Perhaps it was that in her brokenness, he recognized something of himself. He had come to destroy her, but instead he saved her. And in doing so, he saved himself. That night, the rancher stood by the firelight, silent as ever, one hand resting on the mantel beside the old photograph. Clara entered the room, holding the ledger in her arms. The space between them wasn't wide, but what lay in that space was everything they hadn't said. Slowly, with hands that didn't tremble, she set the book down and stepped forward. She reached up and for the first time since that day on the trading post, she pulled down his mask. He didn't resist. The man beneath it wasn't a monster. He wasn't even a ghost. He was scarred. Yes, his jaw lined with burns, one eye slightly clouded, his lips set in a line that knew too much loss. But his eyes were steady, clear, human. He didn't look ashamed. He looked free. Clara raised her hand and touched the side of his face, not with pity, but with quiet absolution. Whatever had brought him here, vengeance, survival, grief, it had passed through her. And what remained was something stronger. The next day, they rode into Clearwater together. The townspeople stepped aside like parting tides, whispers curled through the streets like dust. But this time, Clara didn't look down. She didn't need a wedding dress to command respect. She didn't need a last name that came from a man who betrayed her. She rode tall. Next to him, they visited the blacksmith, the postmaster, the general store. No one dared question why the masked man no longer wore a mask. No one asked why the woman once left behind now wore his coat across her shoulders. The story spread fast. Some said it was love, others said it was madness. But all agreed that something had changed on the frontier. Justice didn't ride in on lawmen or judges. It came in the form of two people who had every reason to hate this world and instead chose to rebuild within it. Back at the ranch, the sky darkened again, but this time with rain instead of smoke. It fell gently over the dry earth, soaking into cracks, feeding the roots long thought dead. Clara stepped outside, let it wash over her, eyes closed, arms open. Inside, the man once known only as the masked rancher placed the scratched photograph into the fire. The flames curled around it and rose, and with it, the last of his ghosts drifted away into the smoke. Their story was never written in ink or law. It was written in the dust, in blood, in quiet defiance. And from that dust, frontier redemption rose not as a myth, but as truth.